Greetings, everybody. Welcome to a retrospective on the use of export cryptography in South Seas GH with David Adrian. Before we begin, a few brief notes. Stop by the business hall located at Bayside AB during the day and for the welcome reception from 1730 to 1900 tonight. The Black Hat Arsenal is on the Palm Foyer on level 3. Join us for the Pony Awards in Mandalay Bay, BCD at 1830. And please put your phone on vibrate. It makes it easier for the rest of us to ignore the ringing while we wait for voicemail to pick it up. And without further ado, here's David.
Hello. Is this on? Awesome. So this is a retrospective on the use of export cryptography. As some of you may have seen on the internet, this has been hailed as the worst named Black Hat talk of all time. So I have an alternate title called The Top 10 Ways Bill Clinton Broke TLS, which should satisfy the BuzzFeeders out there. So first up, who the F is this? I'm David Adrian. I'm a grad student at the University of Michigan, which makes me one of those academic types, venturing out into the lands of industry at Black Hat. I do a lot of work with ZMAP, the internet scanner. I help run census. Our group came up with some of the measurement numbers for vulnerability to heartbleed after disclosure, as well as what I'm going to be talking about today, Freak, Logjam, and Drown. And more recently, I was just working with Chrome team, but I'm no longer employed by Google, and this research was not done while I was at Google, so if you're a Google lawyer in the audience, please don't tackle me. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's dive right in to the 90s, specifically around the time that Al Gore was inventing the internet. So pretty much from its inception, sort of post-World War, cryptography was regulated as something that the military used. It was regulated under the International Traffic in Arms Regulations by the Department of State as sort of a munition. And so in 1995, the status of the regulation was basically that under ITAR, under the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, encryption for non-US citizens was limited to 40 bits of symmetric cipher key strength and 512 bits of public key strength, which at the time was pretty much RSA and Diffie-Hellman. And this was regulated on the munitions list alongside things like tanks and bombs and guns and ships. But interestingly, while encryption was regulated, authentication, so like hash functions and MACs, were not regulated. So at this time in 1995, Daniel J. Bernstein was a grad student at UC Berkeley, DJB. And he created something called the Snuffle crypto system, which was kind of a troll crypto system that did encryption only using hash functions. And so the government didn't really know what to do with it. But he applied for an export license, and the government said no. You are not allowed to export this code or you present your paper outside of the United States. And so DJB sued the government alongside Cindy Cohn, who is now, Cindy Cohn was his lawyer. She's now the director of the EFF. They sued the government, and the result of this was the sort of code as speech case, the case where the phrase code as speech came out, and the Northern District of California overruled the regulations under ITAR and said that they were infringing on DJB's First Amendment rights and they were unconstitutional. And this happened in December of 1996, about a year and a half after the initial Snuffle crypto system. But Bill Clinton, in November of 1996, a month before this ruling, passed an executive order that moved the regulations off of ITAR and onto the export administration regulations, which are sort of the civilian regulations by the Department of State for just like how imports and exports are regulated. So the authority was moved, and that court case was only for ITAR. So they were like, great, you won that court case, but it doesn't mean anything because that law doesn't exist anymore. So DJB and Cindy Cohn re-challenged the regulations under EAR, won again, got overturned, but then eventually the Department of Commerce basically was like, we don't want to deal with this anymore. We're going to stop regulating cryptography, at least open source cryptography. And this happened in 1999. And that's the state we've been in ever since, is that cryptography is no longer regulated for US citizens versus non-US citizens. But while all this was happening in 1995, there was a lot of developments in sort of the field of like the internet and secure transport. Starting with SSL version 2 in 1995, SSL v2 was designed, deployed, and deprecated all in 1 year. It was a terrible protocol that didn't really work. I think this might be a record in sort of design deployment and deprecation speed nowadays. I'd like to see the IETF try doing this in 2016. But it was followed by SSL version 3, which sort of formed the basis for modern TLS, modern transport layer security. And then finally in 1999 came TLS version 1, also known as SSL version 3.1 if you look at the structure of the packets. And this is when the standard really became an official IETF standard and started looking even more modern. But all of this happened before the regulations were overturned. And so all three of these contain what I'm referring to as export cryptography. That is to say, specifically weakened cryptography designed to comply with these regulations. And in fact, the way that they sort of enforced this was kind of silly. Basically, Netscape had two versions. It had the US version and the international version. And the international version only spoke bad crypto, and the US version only, could speak all the crypto that we knew of. And you just were supposed to download the correct one. And so what I'm here to talk about today is I want to show that these export regulations of the 90s that have been overturned for nearly 20 years now are directly harming the security of the internet today. And I'm going to show three different attacks that follow directly out of these regulations because of crypto that was created to comply with these regulations, how they harm modern clients, like a modern Chrome, for example. And another reason that I'm here giving this talk today and that this is important is because this debate over cryptography is starting to come into the public eye again. It's not quite the same as it was in the 90s. Instead, we're hearing terms like going dark and lawful access. But the regulations from the 90s are sort of the best way that we can go back and look at, say, so what happens when you regulate cryptography? And the results were pretty bad. And so right now we have Senator Dianne Feinstein, a Democrat from California. You might also know her from being the mayor of San Francisco that instituted rent control. So everybody's favorite. But she, in a rare display of bipartisanship, along with Senator Richard Burr, introduced the Feinstein-Burr bill into committee a few months ago. And this never made it out of committee, but it effectively made end-to-end encryption illegal. So what I want to do here today is try and show that whenever these regulations happen, bad things ensue possibly decades later. And so the rest of this talk is split into three separate parts, corresponding with three separate publications. The first one is I'm going to talk about the freak attack. The freak attack was originally discovered by some folks at INRIA. It's described in that messy State of the Union paper right there. I got involved with sort of this space in the wake of the freak attack using ZMAP to do measurement to determine the quantity, to quantify the impact. When then freak led directly into Logjam, which we published at CCS about a year ago, was another export-related attack. And then finally, we'll close with Drown. My understanding is that some people think this is a talk about Drown. It's only 1/3 a talk about Drown, so sorry if you're disappointed. But let's get to it. The first thing I want to talk about is freak. So the freak attack is a man-in-the-middle attack against TLS that downgrades people to RSA export. So if you'll bear with me, let's jump back into, say it's the 90s, we're in the room where it happens, and we need to find a way to selectively weaken a protocol based on RSA so that it can comply with these regulations. And the way that we have to do that is by shrinking the public key size. Because remember, the public key size was limited to 512 bits. But we want to make sure that we can use arbitrary sized public keys for US citizens, because the US citizens have been deemed better than the other citizens, so they get strong crypto. And so this brings up the question of how do you pick which RSA key to use? Do you use the strong one or do you use the export compliant one? And the answer that TLS came up with was we'll use a convoluted protocol handshake to figure out which one we should use. And so let's take a look at how that works. I'm going to use this diagram a few times in the talk. On the left, we're going to have Alice, the client, speaking to Bob, the server, and both of them are represented by XKCD characters. And so let's say they're speaking SSL v3 or TLS, so modern HTTPS, you can think of this. And this will start with the client, Alice, sending a client hello to Bob. And for this demonstration, we'll be assuming they're speaking some form of RSA key exchange, which is why Alice sends a cipher that contains RSA. Ciphers define the key exchange and the symmetric cryptography used. The server responds, selects the cipher, sends its certificate to authenticate itself. Its certificate contains its public key, but this public key might be export compliant, or this public key is likely not export compliant. It's larger than 512 bits. And so in a normal handshake, the client would just pull out the public key from that certificate, encrypt it, some key material, both sides would derive the final shared secret, and everything would be great. This is how a normal handshake works. However, to comply for the export regulations, they added this extra message that only gets sent if you're doing what's called an export RSA handshake, meaning you selected the export RSA cipher because you downloaded Netscape International Edition that only speaks export ciphers. And the way that this worked is they added that extra message there in red, the server key exchange message, where they send you a shorter RSA public key, and the client extracts the regulation compliant public key and uses that for the rest of the key exchange. And this public key would only be 512 bits long. However, it turns out that every major TLS implementation did not know how to say no to this message. They would all accept it whether or not you were doing export RSA or normal RSA. If this message showed up, they were happy to extract the shorter public key from it. And effectively, this bug was enough for a man in the middle to take over the connection. And when I say every major TLS implementation, what I mean is OpenSSL, I mean Apple's Secure Transport, which gets shipped with OS X, and I mean Microsoft S-Channel, which is part of Windows. The only one that was not vulnerable was Mozilla's NSS implementation, the one used in Firefox. So let's look at how the attack would work. Let's assume there's a man in the middle on the wire, represented by the red guy in the middle. And so let's assume that Alice is a modern client. Like say you just downloaded Chrome in January of 2015 because Chrome was vulnerable to this attack. It does not contain any of these export ciphers because it's not 1999 anymore. The clients have largely removed all this old cryptography. But we'll assume that the server left the export methods, the export ciphers enabled because the server wants backwards compatibility in case somebody wakes up from a deep sleep and logs in with their Netscape International Edition. In fact, I tried looking for Netscape International Edition about a week ago and couldn't find it anywhere on the internet. It's that hard to find. So what the man in the middle will do is rewrite the cipher to be an export RSA cipher instead of a normal one. And it will present to the client that it's a normal RSA, and it will present to server that it's export RSA. And the server, therefore, will go through and send this extra server key exchange message because it thinks it's doing export RSA. And because of the bug I just described, the client is happy to accept this message. We'll assume that the 512-bit key in the server key exchange message, the extra one that it's sent for export compliance, has been factored by the attacker, and we'll get to why that's a reasonable assumption to make. But for now, just bear with me. And then finally, because the attacker has factored that key, they can then decrypt the pre-master secret that the client encrypts and go through, do the same key derivation function, and insert themselves in the middle for the rest of the handshake. But a quick jump back to factoring. You're likely like, look, David, you said that you were factoring an RSA key. That you shouldn't be able to do that. Factoring is hard. Let's go shopping. Like the entire point of RSA is that factoring is hard. If you can factor a key, like why we'll just factor keys and decrypt everything. Well, the answer to that is you can't factor all keys. But nowadays, because it's not 1999 anymore, 512 bits, what the max export length, which was at least somewhat secure in the 90s, is now factorable for around $100 on Amazon EC2. And you can fiddle with the price to cost ratio. Nadia Henninger and Luke Valenta at UPenn have some work showing using like a combination of like mathematical factoring tools and the standard sort of distributed compute stuff you can get on EC2, how you can optimize cost for factoring. But it's roughly about $100 for a little over an hour. In fact, this isn't so easy to do that last year when I was teaching a course for some undergrads, we gave extra credit to anyone who could factor a 512-bit public key, and a couple of students using some free Amazon credit they got at a hackathon just spun up like an M3.large and factored a 512-bit RSA key and got the extra credit, while everyone else was like, wait, you want us to have a major mathematical breakthrough? What? But they got the right idea. That's why it was extra credit. So effectively, what this means is that anyone who can spend $100 on EC2 can man in the middle a server that supports export RSA in TLS. The client doesn't need to support this, just the server. So from a sort of cost and compute and cryptography standpoint, that's all you need for the attack. But there's another follow-up question for, is this attack feasible or not? And that is, do servers actually support the RSA export cipher, right? This was deprecated. This was effectively useless after 1999. Why do servers still have this enabled? No modern how to configure your TLS server like article will tell you to enable these. So we fired up ZMAP. We connected to every HTTPS host on the internet, checked what ciphers they support, and we found that a few days before the freak disclosure, so the point all the way on the left there, note that the graph's a log scale. About 36.7% of HTTPS servers, so a third of them, supported export RSA. And then there's that steep drop off there. That's when freak disclosure happened. And people patched this very quickly, down to under 10% at about 6% a week later, and it's been slowly decreasing ever since. So the answer to the feasibility question is, before disclosure, this attack was super feasible. 1 in 3 HTTPS servers were vulnerable to it. Another thing that I want to note, when we were running freakattack.com, we were also, so that's the server-side vulnerability. The client-side vulnerability is you have this bug in your TLS implementation. This bug has now been patched in every major browser. But we were sort of trying to detect on the clients which ones were vulnerable and which ones were not on our site. I don't want to make like broad scientific claims about the data here, because we had some issues getting it collected, as well as this isn't necessarily a representative sample of internet users like who goes to freakattack.com after a TLS vuln. This is a very specific subset of people. But we did notice that about 10% of the vulnerable population was reporting as Firefox. And we were like, why is Firefox showing up vulnerable? Shouldn't we know that NSS wasn't vulnerable to it? It's the only library that wasn't vulnerable. Turns out that this is because people have like Avast or Symantec or various other end host like man-in-the-middle software that's doing added value and securing your HTTPS connections by man-in-the-middling it on your host. These libraries would use S-channel or OpenSSL internally, which were then vulnerable to the freak attack. So if you installed antivirus and used Firefox, you were probably vulnerable. Whoops. A couple notes on mitigations. Server side, disable RSA export ciphers. Client side, patch your clients. Everybody patched really, or all of the browsers released patches within days. Anyone who's just been getting updates should be no longer vulnerable to this. And then there's some more information on freakattack.com. In terms of origins of this vulnerability, although this was a implementation bug, and I don't want to say that this had to happen, but this implementation bug could not have possibly happened if the export regulations didn't exist. If SSL had been implemented 1 year later after DJB had won its court case, we would not have seen this bug because we would not have needed these mechanisms in the protocol that allowed the bug to exist in the first place. And adding in these mechanisms just makes it really hard to reason about what you're implementing and how the protocol works, because now you have these sort of disparate state machines, one for export, one for non-export, that you need to be able to reason with about how they interact. And the root of Freak was that they were interacting in a way we thought they wouldn't. We thought they were isolated, but they were not. So that's all I have on Freak. Now I'd like to move on to just quickly go through Logjam. There's lots of other stuff up on the internet about Logjam and various details, but I just want to sort of give the high-level overview here. Logjam followed directly out of Freak. It's another man-in-the-middle downgrade attack, but instead of attacking export RSA, We're attacking the other type of public key encryption that at the time that was regulated, which is to say export Diffie-Hellman. So once again, let's go back in time. Let's pretend we're one of the SSL version 3 designers and that we need to make our protocol compliant with the regulations. And our protocol contains Diffie-Hellman, so how do we do that? Well, the answer is we need to use a shorter prime for Diffie-Hellman, or group size, however you want to call it, shorter modulus. All different words for the same thing. It needs to be only 512 bits. Then once again, how do we select which prime to use? Well, the answer was convoluted protocol handshake again. So before I go through how it works in TLS, I just want to do a quick refresher of Diffie-Hellman. This is the classic Diffie-Hellman explanation picture from Wikipedia that I imagine many of you have seen before. So what we have at the top is we have Alice talking to Bob, and they have some common set of parameters. The common set of parameters in the pictures is the yellow paint. In math terms, this is your prime, P, also referred to as the modulus, and your generator, G. Then they each pick some secret value, which is the exponents. Then they combine the exponents with the generator, modulo P. That's the public values, the orange and blue. And then both sides can take the other's public value, combine it with their secret value, and get the shared secret, which in this case is the brown paint. I also like to think that this diagram really illustrates the issues with using a short prime, because when there's only 6 colors, pretty much all of them combine to brown, right? Like if someone was actually using paint as a mechanism for a shared secret, I think we could all break that crypto system pretty easily. And sort of the same thing applies when you're using a short prime. So what is Logjam? Logjam is a downgrade attack against TLS. It leverages export Diffie-Hellman instead of export RSA. And it requires that the attacker, rather than factor a key, be able to compute discrete logs, so undo the Diffie-Hellman operation. And so instead of spending $100 on EC2 to do this, it's a little more expensive. It takes about 1 week of pre-computation per prime, which sounds unreasonable at the moment, but we'll get back to why that's feasible. First, I'd like to go through the protocol and show sort of how this works. Once again, Alice talking to Bob. We'll say Alice is a modern version of Chrome. We'll say in like April of 2015 before disclosure. Alice wants to speak Diffie-Hellman, so she sends a cipher, a DHE Diffie-Hellman ephemeral cipher. We'll assume the server selects this cipher. Just like before, it's going to send its certificate. But rather than using an RSA public key in the certificate, the server is also going to send over the parameters needed for Diffie-Hellman, so the yellow paint. In this case, that's the P and the G, the prime and the generator, as well as its public values, so the orange or the blue paint. And then the client will go through, finish Diffie-Hellman, do the key derivation, and everybody's happy. However, if you're speaking an export cipher, you need to redo this to make sure that it's compliant, meaning that that prime can only be 512 bits. And in fact, the way that TLS did this was simply by saying, if you're using an export cipher, export DHE cipher, it's exactly the same as a normal Diffie-Hellman exchange, same protocol flow, same messages. Just that prime needs to be only 512 bits. So this has the side effect of meaning that if you just pull any random key exchange message, server key exchange for Diffie-Hellman message off the wire, no way to distinguish an export one and a non-export one aside from the key length. But you also don't know what size the prime is going to be anyway, right? Because the server is sending it to you. The server might be picking a 16-bit prime, which Safari was happened to negotiate until like 2 weeks ago, or a few months ago, rather. Or they might be sending you like a 16,000-bit prime because the server is super paranoid. You don't know which one is coming. So you don't actually know if this is a export or non-export key exchange. So that leads itself to the Logjam attack. Once again, we'll have an attacker on the wire who rewrites the ciphers to be export. We have Chrome on the left and a server supporting export DHE on the right. And then the server, because it thinks it's speaking export, is going to send a 512-bit prime because it doesn't want to get arrested. And then the client doesn't know what size was coming anyway, is more than happy to take that message because it's identical to the non-export version, and negotiates a TLS connection using only 512 bits worth of security. And then at this point, we'll assume that the attacker can undo the Diffie-Hellman here because it's only 512 bits. So in terms of feasibility, you need 2 things for this attack. The first thing is you need the server to support DHE export. And the second thing is you need to be able to do the pre-computation, which is a sort of per prime operation. 1 week pre-computation, then basically free connection breaks on the prime. So that means that if this is going to be feasible, servers need to be sharing prime numbers. They do. This is fine because these are the common parameters. These are often standardized into protocols. They just happen to not be in TLS. Instead, they tend to be baked into web servers. So to figure out if this was feasible or not, once again, we fired up our internet scanner. We connected every HTTPS server on the internet, and we checked two things. One, do they support the DHE export cipher? And two, what prime do they send us? For the first one, for DHE export support, we see that they do. It doesn't have that giant leap up to like 30%, and that's likely because we didn't because Logjam followed from Freak. That's where we got the idea from. We didn't have the scan data for support for RSA export, or excuse me, for DHE export until after the Freak disclosure. And so if you layer the Freak graph on top, you see that they track each other very closely. So if I were a betting man, and apparently I am because I'm in Vegas, I would say that Diffie-Hellman export was way higher before the Freak disclosure, and lots of people just turned off both at the same time. The sort of gap between the two lines is likely due to the fact that Microsoft's web server IIS, it did support export RSA, but it never supported export Diffie-Hellman. So the curve is a little bit lower. And then if you look at the Alexa top 1 million, so the most common visited sites on the internet, about 8.5% of them are vulnerable. But if you go and look at what primes they're using, of those 8.5%, 92% are using one of two primes. So 82% of them are using one that was shipped with Apache mod SSL. It's literally in the source code, hard-coded in. And another 10% are using a similar one that gets shipped with Nginx. So in sort of cost terms, what that means is you can do 2 1-week pre-computations, one for the mod SSL prime and one for the Nginx prime. And then once you've done that, you could that would get you 92% of vulnerable servers you would then be able to attack. So to get the long tail, cost starts going up. But many servers, including FBI.gov, were using that Nginx prime and a 500 and supported RSA export. If you go to WeakDH, you can see a demo of a man in the middle against FBI.gov. And if you go to Twitter and you look up, I think it's called dlog_bot, you can tweet at the bot and it will calculate discrete logs in those two groups for you. If Nadia students happen to still have it up, it goes down a lot. I think we also might have taken it down because someone made a Twitter account that had done literally nothing. It was an empty account except tweet at this bot and get discrete logs. And we were like, something about this seems suspicious. Like this person might actually be exploiting Logjam. So I think they might have taken it down. So Logjam is at least somewhat feasible, a little theoretical, but it does have some implications for standards. And when I'm saying standards, I mean things like RFCs and that. The first one is that you really don't want to have negotiable Diffie-Hellman parameters in a protocol. You want to standardize them. The problem with standardizing them, though, is you need to make sure you do a good job and that they'll last for 2 decades or more. So you have this tension between wanting to standardize things to decrease brittleness so that you can't have servers sending weak primes or you don't know what there's coming. But at the same time, you don't want to bake in weak parameters into your protocol. So if you were back in 1995 or 1996 designing SSL v3, you certainly wouldn't really want to standardize in some 512-bit primes into your protocol just so that you're regulation compliant. The writing was on the wall for those regulations. Like the court case was happening, it had been won once, and then it was happening again. It was probably going to be won again. Why would you want to add that to your protocol when it's just going to be gone in a year? And it's kind of appealing that when you let the server pick the prime, it's kind of appealing that then you have this protocol where the security is as strong as the server wants. If you have a really paranoid server, it can send you a big prime. And if you have a really lazy server, it can send you a 16-bit prime. And this is sort of attractive from a protocol design point of view. But in terms of mitigations, once again, we have two sides. For the server, disable DHE export. And for the client, if you get newer versions of Chrome, and pretty much every browser now, I think the last one to patch was in September of 2015, they all just reject short primes now. So they don't necessarily know if you're getting a short prime because you're being man-in-the-middled or just because the server likes short primes, but no browser will accept the shorter than 1024-bit prime, and 1024 bits is well out of the reach of anyone on EC2. So that effectively mitigates the attack client side. And in fact, the Chrome added a new error for short primes. It looks like this, the error weak ephemeral key. A friend of mine back at Michigan who does embedded systems, IoT stuff, one time he messaged me and he was like, I was trying to connect to this IoT device and I keep getting this SSL error in Chrome. I blame you. And I was like, well, what was the error? And he shows me a picture of it, and it's error weak ephemeral Diffie-Hellman key, which came directly out of the research we did with Logjam. And I was like, well, you know what? I'll take the blame for this one. This one was actually my fault. But even more exciting, though, Chrome is just totally dropping finite field, so prime number-based Diffie-Hellman in the next version, I believe. And so they'll only support elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman, which isn't vulnerable to the same type of attack. And in fact, if you download Chrome Canary, I think all the Diffie-Hellman is gone, thanks to some good work by David Benjamin at Google. So that's Freak, that's Logjam. They're pretty similar. They both have to do with TLS. Now we come to Drown, which is a slightly different flair. So we've hit the two types of key exchange that were regulated, RSA and Diffie-Hellman. Now let's finish the trifecta and nail export compliant symmetric ciphers, the ones that were limited to 40 bits. So once again, ask yourselves, if you have a protocol based on symmetric ciphers, how do you weaken it? TLS sidestepped this problem by changing the key derivation function. What SSL v2 did was you're like, well, if we can only use 5 bytes, so 40 bits in our key, we'll just send n minus 5 bytes in the clear text and only encrypt the last 5. And then just combine the two parts. And then you're nice and compliant. And that's how export ciphers worked in SSL v2. But before I go on too much farther, I just want to note a couple things about SSL v2. One is that, yes, I know it's completely broken. We're not trying to come up with some new attack on SSL v2 here. Everyone knows that it's already man-in-the-middleable. What we want to do with SSL v2 is find a way to leverage it to attack modern TLS. Freaking Logjam showed that supporting old types of cryptography isn't just harmless backwards compatibility, it's actually hurting the security of modern clients. And so the question that we wanted to answer when we first started looking at SSL v2 was, is SSL v2 just like a harmless vestigial organ left over, or is it actually harmful to modern clients? And so the first to answer that, the first question was, does anyone support SSL v2 anymore? And the answer was a surprisingly large number of people do. So this graph here is a CDF of the top 1 million domains and the percentage that of the top N that support TLS and the percentage of the top N that support SSL v2. So you can see that all of the top 10 support TLS. That's like Google, Facebook, LinkedIn. But down at the bottom, the blue curve, the SSL v2 curve, you can see that there's a peak. That's at site rank number 16, which is Weibo, the Chinese version of Twitter. It supported SSL v2. After that, not a whole lot. But once you get down to some lower ranked sites, you see that somewhere around, I think, 12 or 17% of the top 1 million sites supported SSL v2. And that to us was enough of an indicator that we should look at this more because people actually are supporting SSL v2. And in fact, if you go and look at it outside of HTTPS, while about, let's see here, 17% of HTTPS servers supported SSL v2, 28% of mail servers of SMTP servers supported SSL v2, which was really weird. We couldn't figure out why support was this high. But then it turns out that, as often it does, there's another bug in OpenSSL. So there's this old backwards compatibility handshake for when you're switching from SSL v2 to SSL v3, where you can upgrade a v2 handshake to v3. And so what lots of mail servers and web servers had done was that in their default ciphers, default OpenSSL config that gets shipped out of the box with the web server, they didn't disable SSL v2. They disabled every single SSL v2 cipher, of which there are only 6. I think 2 of them were export compliant and 4 of them were other ciphers. They disabled all those ciphers. but they left SSL v2 enabled so that they could still support these upgrade handshakes from 2 to 3. However, there is a bug in OpenSSL's implementation where a sufficiently motivated client that really wanted to negotiate SSL v2 could ignore what the server said and just pick a random cipher and negotiate SSL v2. So no one noticed this because the OpenSSL client behaved nicely and would fail when you tried to do v2 with these servers. But a aggressive client or a scanner that was written really quickly and didn't fully read the RFC, well, that just randomly picked a cipher if the server didn't give one, would also negotiate it, which is how we saw so many of these. And in fact, some other folks over in Germany, Nimrod Aviram and Sebastian Schnitzel, had reported this to OpenSSL around the time that I was looking. So that cipher selection bug was patched in January of 2016. Which brings us to Drown. So I'm going to gloss over a lot of the crypto details here, but if you're interested, the technical term for Drown is that it is a cross-protocol Bleikenbacher padding oracle attack, which effectively means that using the export ciphers that are available in SSL v2 and the way that the RSA encryption is handled in those, you can use that to attack a TLS connection. And this is a little bit complicated because the crypto that's used in SSL v2, the lengths of the secrets, and the way that it's encrypted isn't formatted correctly for TLS. So you have to play some crypto tricks to change the SSL v2 crypto to look like TLS crypto. But effectively, if you capture some TLS handshakes, and the handshakes are done with a server that has a key, that the key that the server is using for TLS is also used for SSL v2, either on that server as well or on a mail server somewhere else that's using the same key and certificate. You can capture those ciphertexts off the wire and then retroactively decrypt them for about $400 on EC2, which is kind of expensive, but also kind of cool if you're a crypto nerd. And one of the big cool things about Drown that makes it a little bit different is that this cross-protocol thing works, that you can use your SMTP server to attack, you can use someone's SMTP server to attack their web server. Because if you're a sysadmin, you're probably thinking a lot more about your web server that's running your production website than you are thinking about that random SMTP server that you spun up in order to like send monitoring emails or whatever about your site. I know I did. And so if you look at this sort of key reuse where only 17% of HTTPS servers supported SSL v2, but if you went and tried to find keys on other protocols, that raises vulnerability of Drown from 17% to 33%. So we're back at about 1/3 of the internet being vulnerable to another export-related attack. And these full numbers are available on drownattack.com. And unlike freaking Logjam, the initial patching was a lot slower. Likely because Drown is a bit more complicated. It's a little harder to explain. I just explained it right now, and I'm already disappointed with my explanation. It's sort of a complicated thing, and it's cross-protocol, and you have to really know what's on your network to be able to fully patch. So it's possible some people went and patched and turned off SSL v2 on their HTTPS server, but totally missed the fact that it was enabled on their mail server. And the fact that the OpenSSL client won't even negotiate SSL v2 with these servers makes it even harder to detect because you can't detect support for it with out-of-the-box tools. So that brings us to Special Drown. Everything I described so far, the sort of offline attack where you monitor some connections, you save them, and then you use the SSL v2 server as an oracle to decrypt them after the fact, is the variant of Drown called General Drown, and it costs $400 every time you want to do it. Special Drown is a variant of it that leverages an implementation bug that was accidentally patched in March of 2015. People didn't realize that the bug existed. Just other code changes happened to remove it in OpenSSL. That removes the $400 cost. It basically lets you do it on a laptop in about a minute instead of on a bunch of GPUs on EC2. And so if you go and you probe servers to see if they are patched or not, you can do this by sending a specially formatted SSL v2 hello. You'll see that not as many as General Drown, but a decent number, around 9% of the top 1 million and mid 20% of trusted HTTPS were vulnerable to the man-in-the-middle variant, Special Drown of Drown. And this, not only is this attack cheaper, but you can do this way more often because it runs faster. You don't even need to find a site that otherwise would be using export RSA. Like in practice, general drown is very difficult to pull off. Special drown, once you've made it through all the crypto, is actually not that hard. You can do it on a normal laptop. You don't need a bunch of special conditions. You just need to write lots and lots of sort of padding Oracle code. So, and if you're interested in the details of special drown or general drown, come find me after the talk. I will do my best to answer your questions, or I will direct you to drownattack.com and our paper. We rewrote the whole paper about a month ago. And so I think it should be easier to read now. If you ever attempted reading it before and it didn't make sense, sorry, it should be clearer now. But in terms of mitigations and lessons from drown, obviously you need to fully disable SSL v2. Don't just disable the ciphers. And this is really, I think, the nail in the coffin for leaving old crypto online for backwards compatibility. We just keep finding ways that it is harming modern clients. So stop leaving old things enabled for backwards compatibility. Another sort of interesting takeaway that you might get from drown is that you're not going to be vulnerable to drown if your mail server supports SSL v2 and your website doesn't if they're using different keys. So it might be prudent to, in fact, use different keys for different protocols or different protocol versions. In the same way that we talk about using different keys for signatures and encryption. And then from a crypto standpoint, what prevents this in newer versions of TLS is that the client is authenticated before the server sends secret-derived data. Effectively, that would make anything an online attack instead of an offline attack. And so this is why modern versions of TLS aren't vulnerable. Just a couple more sort of broad implications and lessons that I'd like to take away from these three attacks. The first ones have to deal with protocol design and technology standpoint. Obsolete cryptography needs to be considered harmful in the same way that anything else that is considered harmful is considered harmful. It's not just something that you're leaving online for backwards compatibility. Every time that you leave SSL v2 enabled, you're hurting the modern clients, the people who are keeping up to date. From a protocol design standpoint, limiting complexity is really key. A lot of these things weren't noticed simply because of how complex either the code in OpenSSL had to be just to implement TLS, because TLS itself is very complicated. And from the separate state machines for export and non-export. Putting these together is just a recipe for complexity, and complexity is always the enemy of the secure when it comes to cryptography. And the other that I don't really think I would have to iterate this, but I want to really make this point, which is that weakened cryptography, these export regulations should be considered harmful, not just from a perhaps legal standpoint in the way that they argued in the court case in the 90s, but from a security standpoint. We just hit every form of export weakened cryptography and used it to attack modern clients in one way or another. We hit the weakened RSA with Freak, we hit weakened Diffie-Hellman with Logjam, and we hit weakened symmetric ciphers with Drown. We nailed the trifecta. There's not a version of export cryptography that hasn't been used to attack modern clients now. From a policy standpoint, keep in mind that crypto regulations leave lasting effects. That these regulations were overturned in the 90s, but we're just discovering these attacks nearly 20 years later. And that there's this concept, the concept that you could have different encryption for US and non-US citizens just doesn't make sense on the internet. Even if you just connect to Facebook, your traffic might even be going outside of the US and back in because of the way CDNs and networks work. It's not really possible to assign cryptography based on nationality. And so the technological, while weakening cryptography in the way that these regulations did, is not the same as lawful access and what is being proposed, or the going dark problem and things that have been proposed recently. It's the closest that we've seen to it actually happening in practice. And the technological evidence for this suggests that any form of weakening, any form of lawful access, any form of enabling someone who is not either the client, not on one end of the connection, to have some access to an encrypted channel is a recipe for disaster. And so with that, I think we have about 5 or 6 minutes left for questions. Once again, I'm David Adrian, University of Michigan. All the attacks that I described are described online, as well as the papers at those websites. Hit me up on Twitter, contact me. Thank you for attending and for getting up early and for coming out here.
Question with regard to the short keys. Did you see any instances where the key was not dynamically generated and in fact it was a reusable static key?
For Freak RSA, the short keys, they were reused. We didn't see any that were hard-coded into a server implementation, but pretty much every server that supported it would generate them at the time they were launched. And then they would remain used until the process was killed, likely when the server was rebooted, so months at a time.
Anyone else?
I have a quick question. I noted that you had mentioned the use of elliptical curve, but NSA recently decided to move away from elliptical curve in their Suite B protocols. Did that come up in your discussions?
So they moved away. I assume you're talking about the updated Suite B recommendations for post-quantum crypto.
They basically removed out all elliptical curve.
They did not remove all of them. They removed P256, but they left P520, whatever the other one is.
Right.
And what they did suggest was that people who haven't bothered to move to elliptic curves yet should just not bother, because we expect a new cryptography will be coming down in the future. Elliptic curves are still the best that we have. And if you don't like the NIST curves, there's lots of crypto from DJB that's making its way into TLS right now, such as Curve 25519, that are also sort of state of the art for what we have now. But these won't be quantum resistant, but we don't have a good quantum resistant solution yet.
In your analysis of weak implementations on the public internet, did you see a significant portion of the weakness in, for lack of a better term, service providers such as Content Delivery Network or ISPs that do reverse proxying, and would that potentially have impacted large numbers of principals in a way that was outside of the principal's control?
We saw a little bit of that. We didn't do sort of a deep analysis into who was vulnerable. I believe that for a while on some servers, I think Akamai might have supported RSA export. I'm not sure. But for example, on Drown, we saw there was an ISP in Europe where they had given a valid certificate to every user, I think for remote access, and whatever software they were using for that was vulnerable to Drown. There's been a couple hosting providers, I think, not really major CDNs, but a hosting provider, I can't think of the names off the top of my head, that were vulnerable to either Freak or Logjam or Drown. But I don't have a good answer for you. Some of it, sure. I didn't do a detailed analysis, though.
Sorry. What are your thoughts in terms of, I guess, backward compatibility for whether it's old installations of Java or an IoT device or old mobile phones? I mean, one of the challenges with where you have a browser that you can update, it becomes an easy challenge.
Yeah.
But when a third of the traffic that we're getting is still what I would consider obsolete equipment, and we don't control that and we can't update it, what do we do then?
Well, there's obsolete and there's obsolete. While older versions of Java, for example, don't support elliptic curves, you certainly don't need SSL v2 or any of the export ciphers to talk to them. A lot of them are just stuck on TLS version 1 or version 1.1, speaking just like older CBC ciphers, which people are starting to talk about. We have better than that. There are things that are better than that. But as far as we know, that's not nearly the same harm that the export ciphers were causing. That being said, I would like to think that what we saw here is sort of an impetus for trying to solve this problem more broadly, for harassing people to update, for calling people out for not updating, and for at some point just being like, you know what, it's not worth it to support these. And I recognize that not everyone can, but I do know that there's been a bit more of a trend among some people to stop maintaining so much for backwards compatibility and just be like, you go and get a newer version. But that's not always possible for everybody.
One more, and then we're going to go into the hallway. Okay. Can I ask you, to what extent do you think we're done hearing about TLS vulnerabilities? I mean, next year are we going to hear about another 3 major weaknesses? Or is this thing finally hardened?
I don't know, but I do know that TLS version 1.3, which is currently being standardized, has had the folks at INRIA, people who have been finding vulns in current versions of TLS, have been working with the standardizers, have been doing formal analysis, and people have a much better understanding of what works and what doesn't now. And there's a lot of smart people working on TLS 1.3. So I have a lot of faith that as TLS 1.3 finishes up, it will be much better than what we have now. But I can't envision the future.
So my question was, I think, very related to. Yeah, sure.
Thank you.